Hello, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank the Romanian Culture Institute in London and Mariela Neagu as well for inviting me for this talk. I hope a good talk today. My name is Luciana Jinga. I'm a researcher. I'm a historian. I hold a PhD in contemporary history from the University of Angers, France. My journey in this research field of childcare system and child abandonment started like 14 years ago in 2007 when I joined these wonderful researchers at the Institute for the Investigation of Communist Crimes in Bucharest, Romania. At the time, they started this project on the pro-natalist policies of Nicolae Ceausescu's regime, known as the ban of abortions in communist Romania. Part of my research for this project was an analysis of the childcare system in the 70s and the 80s, and of course the phenomenon of child abandonment at the time. I must confess, I was very, very biased when I started this project. For me, childcare and abandonment was similar with the pictures of dying children that we all know from international mass media in the 1990s. So I thought my job was quite an easy one. I was going to see what was going bad in the system, that everything was not done properly, and that was all. A couple of years after I started to work on the documents and the testimonies, I realized that nothing I believed at the beginning was actually true. And we don't have here the time to discuss all the elements of my research, but I'm going to point out three major contributions and elements that really astonished me as a Romanian, as a historian, as a researcher. The first one is challenging the myth that all the children were orphans, like the definition of classical definition of an orphan, a child without parents. The majority of those children, like 90% of the children placed in the care system had in fact a family, biological parents, and most of them even knew their biological parents. Yes, we can say they were like social orphans. They were placed in the care of the state because of poverty and other social reasons, but they certainly had families that were not at all orphans. A second element, maybe the most important, the existence of a clear segregation between children. And when I say between children, I mean between healthy children, normal children, and children with disabilities. And subsequently, the institutions that cared for them followed the same segregation in terms of conditions, living conditions, access to education, and everything else. So on one hand, we have what is called the normal orphanage, Casa de Copii, that cared for healthy children. On the other hand, we have the homes for children with disabilities. And here we have several layers, let's say, children that were recoverable, because that was the term, or partially recoverable, and those who were deemed as unrecoverable. So they were to no use for the Romanian communist society. And in this case, the living conditions were in fact the horrifying, and the pictures we all know from the 1990s reflect the reality in those institutions, but we have to clearly differentiate between them, because it does not describe the whole picture of the childcare system in the communist Romania. And the third element that drew my attention was the problem of international adoptions, inter-country adoptions, with Romania as sending country during the communist regime. In fact, it was Professor Yves Denecher, who works at University, at Angers University, who talked to me about this subject. And at the time, I was really reluctant because I was working on this harsh pro-natalist policy, pushing for more and more children. So it was quite unusual, not even logic, to have children sent abroad for adoption in these conditions. But in fact, yes, Romania had this international adoptions even during the communist regime in the 70s and mostly in the 80s. And of course, it's like early start of the problem we all know of after the fall of the communist regime. I ended this first research with a publication in 2011, and for some years I just sit on the results, feeling there is something else there. First of all, the problem of the international adoptions really bothered me, and I had this feeling that I should do more about it. And second, the problem of the homes for unrecoverable children also was like, I had this feeling that as a researcher, I could have done more and to present the subject to the public. So in 2017, the Institute for the Investigation of Communist Crimes, the memory of the Romanian Exile, where I work as a researcher, decided to move forward with the subject, and we decided to go to the Romanian justice and present this case, with the hope that at least 30 years after the fall of the communist regime, some justice will be made for these children that died in horrific conditions. And the same year, I had the chance to start a postdoctoral project on the transnational humanitarian aid towards children in Romania. So once again, building on my previous research results, I looked at the transformation of the childcare system in Romania through the lens of the humanitarian NGOs. So I had the opportunity to analyze how things changed or not, and how much money got invested in this area, with what results. So this is like my link with Mariela, and I hope that she will continue to present you like the events after 1990 and what happened with the transformation of the system.
Thank you so much, Luciana. It's wonderful to meet you this way after citing your work in my research, and it's wonderful to have this combination of social research, I think, and history. Indeed, I'd like to thank the Romanian Cultural Institute for taking the initiative to look at the subject, which was so important for Romania, and I believe it has affected the Romanian psychology. My name is Mariela Neagu, and I'm a researcher. I moved to Oxford 9 years ago, initially to do a master's in human rights after I had been working on a policy in reforming the child protection system in Romania. At the European Commission delegation, Romania had this quite singular, exceptional condition for accession to the European Union, that it should get its child protection system in order. That was not the case for any other countries in Eastern Europe. So I worked for the Commission until 2007, when Romania became a member of the European Union. And then I was the head of the Child Protection Agency for a couple of years. And then a few years later, I moved to Oxford and shifted my career towards research as a new way to influence change. And I think I should say a few words about what happened in the 1990s. I started work on this in 1999, when, 9-10 years after the Romanian Revolution, which was so spectacular, which was immediately followed by those images you spoke about, Luciana, of children in institutions. It had become a sort of cause celeb, in the 1990s, that the wives of the Beatles did the fundraising. Blue Peter, a famous children's program in England, wanted to fundraise, I think, £600,000, a lot of money for those times, especially for Romania, and we ended up fundraising £6 million. Going to Romania, but in addition to this money, there were hundreds and thousands of volunteers who went, after they saw those images, to either help the institutions and improve conditions in a poverty-stricken country, in a post-conflict country in a way, because Romania was like, it was after the end of the Cold War. And obviously that didn't always have the expected impact, perhaps. And the 90s were years of a lot of transformation in many ways, but a lot of people indeed went to Romania to adopt children. So the number of children who were adopted rocketed. The system, yes, indeed, the old communist system had sent children to inter-country adoption. Ceausescu himself had to sign the decree, as far as I know. But the number was higher and higher. And there was also always this idea that, it's better for children to go abroad, that institutions are bad, that inter-country adoption is good, that Romanians don't want to adopt children. So all these stereotypes that they are orphan, they have no parents, and their parents don't love them, or if they do. So this sort of, and indeed, like you said, irrecoverable. Now, they were so exposed that they became a sort of subject for the media, and also subject to several research studies. And I think I had the idea of my research many years before I knew I would ever be a researcher, really wondering what is true. Is it really true that children who are raised in institutions are doing worse than those who are raised in adoption? How bad is it? And all these questions which I addressed later on. I should also make reference to happened in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, the reform of the child protection system, which meant that institutions started to be closed down. Initially, the idea was that, they would be better managed by local authorities, by local people. A number of changes happened. Children started to go to mainstream schools rather than having their own schools attached to the institution. And what happened in 1999 when I started to work on behalf of the European Commission delegation with the government was that there was a new rapporteur for Romania, Baroness Nicholson, who took this quite personal. She put the issue of children on the top of the political agenda with the government and ensuring that the reform was going to be pushed. Now, Baroness Nicholson had been to Romania before in 1990, and that's why she got involved in a way in which the European Parliament, whom she represented, she was the rapporteur of the European Parliament for Romania's accession, in a context in which, you know, not all the member states wanted Romania to be a member state of the European Union, so there was that politics as well. And in addition to this political pressure, there was also the interest of the European Commission to address. The Commission itself was under international media and some NGOs pressure that Romania shouldn't become a member of the European Union because of the situation of children. Indeed, in 1999, when I called someone in Brussels as my boss, the head of the EU delegation at the time, there was a humanitarian crisis when I started the job. So salaries of the staff hadn't been paid following this process of transfer of power from central level to local level. Children were starving in institutions, so the situation was pretty grim. And when I called Brussels, ECHO, which is the humanitarian office, they were surprised because Romania was a candidate country to accede to the European Union. So it wasn't possible to be a beneficiary of humanitarian aid, or you had to be, as a country, one or the other. So the situation was pretty complex, but the Commission made a commitment at the time that it will pay for the reform which is required. Now, the reform was quite complex. The reform involved not only closure of institutions, of children's homes, and that always raised the question, okay, but what will you do with the children? So the money which came from Brussels to create to place children in foster care, so with foster families, or to encourage domestic adoption. I have to say that as part of that process, inter-country adoption was banned, a moratorium was introduced, and I'll refer to that a little bit later. So it was the creation of services, but also a public awareness campaign, which was quite large. I think a lot of young people, I made this days in Oxford, people who are now in their maybe early 30s will still remember it, although there are children then, like the children's home is not a real home, with lots of awareness to the wider public about this transformation which was happening at the time. So it was the public awareness campaign, it was the money to train professionals, to create new services for children, to take children into families mainly, or in small group homes. And it was also the change of legislation, which was done with a group of high-level experts from different countries in the European Union. So we had a former judge from the European Human Rights Court, a very high, somebody with a high profile in the United Nations, somebody from who was also a judge from Belgium. So what I'm trying to say is that from the 1990s, child protection became very much a foreign affairs matter. And I wrote an article about, which is called Children by Request, Romania's Children Between Rights and International Politics, because what was clear when in the early 2000s was that, or late 90s, 2099, 2000, around that time, was that Romania was on number 3 in the world in terms of the number of children who were sent for adoption. It was, at the time, it was like a regulated market. That was known. There was a report which was conducted in Romania by Alin Teodorescu, and as following that report and the report from USAID, there was other knowledge as well. The government understood that there was no way to stop, the malpractices which are happening in inter-country adoption other than by putting a moratorium. Now, that's not unusual. In every other country where inter-country adoption happened, those malpractices. And I actually explained that from a human rights perspective and from a children's rights perspective, it's just not the right thing to do, because a country has a duty to protect its children, not to, to provide for them, not to send them to other countries. Those, no matter how well intentioned, those episodes in history were wrong in Romania, were wrong in England, who had the migrant children in the 1950s, again, where there was this belief that the children would do better off in Australia than working on a farm or, being sent to institutions than they were here post-war. So this is the wide background of the reform process. Now, when Romania acceded to the European Union in 2007, the reform was regarded as a success. Lots of institutions had been closed down, not all of them, but we made a priority from the lagons, the institutions for very young children, 0 to 3 years old, and indeed, institutions for children with special needs, but lots of other children as well. Also, the legislation which was introduced, so, which was very much based on discussions with those high-level experts, and Baroness Nicholson brought Andrew Bainham, a senior scholar from England, was a professor of family law at Cambridge at the time. So all these things created the sort of a significant transformation of the system, of the child protection system, and Romania became a regional model in many ways. The new legislation, for example, banned the institutionalization of children who are under 2 years of age. It extended the support for children beyond who are in institutions beyond age 18 up to 26 years of age if I attended some form of education. So lots of changes happened. At the same time, in parallel, there were a number of studies following these children in England, in Canada, in the United States, sort of taking a medical approach, if you like, measuring different abilities of children. And the results were quite mixed, but very often it was the idea that, placing a child into an institution at an early age, can have a long-term impact on their development. Now, that was not necessarily news, because both Bowlby and Bronfenbrenner, you know, some really important names in research of child development, had already signaled this. Michael Ruther, who followed on Bowlby's work here in England, also had built on the initial attachment theory, saying, well, yeah, the child does need a person of who they are attached to in their early life. Now, there is more recent research, and the reason I'm mentioning it because it is that I think it's relevant for what I found in my own research. Language, for example, is mother tongue, is what the language child hears in the first 6 months of their life. So even before they start to speak. So that means that, you know, there is a lot children accumulate. And I think, you know, it's still a mystery, despite lots of brain research we've seen up until now. It's still a mystery how much a child understands and what they know. And I think that brings me to my own research. So what I wanted to really understand was, in the first place, to understand the perspectives of the young people. Now, what was interesting was that, you know, when the crisis started in 1990, with that very narrow, I would say, portrayal, you know, that they're orphaned and unloved and, you know, all the rest of it, without really trying to understand the wider picture. So I wanted to see what happened to the children who were born around that time. Now, those children were 18, so became adults in 2007, around that time, when Romania became a member of the European Union. So in many ways, were the children of the reform, all these changes, all these political battlegrounds, because, you know, I haven't mentioned, but when Romania stopped inter-country adoptions, lots, well, not lots, but quite a few countries who used to take children into adoption, United States, Spain, Italy in particular, the few others, France as well, started to advocate very strongly for Romania to resume inter-country adoption. Although, you know, if we look at the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it's almost excluded. And we don't have time to go into the reasons why it is excluded, but, you know, there was always some reluctance, and it was already, you know, in the 80s when the convention was written. So both inter-country adoption and residential care were sort of controversial areas. Domestic adoption had its own stereotypes. Romanians don't want to adopt. Romanians, you know, only want young and healthy babies, and foster care as well. You know, some people saying, you know, they only do it for the money. So what is true from all of this? So when I interviewed the children, which was around about 5 years ago, so they were around 25 years of age, and I did life history interviews. So I wanted to understand how they made sense of being in care, how they arrived in care, and in the different types of care which they had, because, you know, quite a few have different trajectories. A lot of them had experienced residential care, so they were in children's homes, in Casa de Copii when they were young children, and some went later on. Some stayed in those institutions until they became adults. Some went into foster care at some point because the reform started, so more children started to go into foster care. And I wanted to understand also the adoption story, you know, what was it in there? And I looked at both domestic adoption and international adoption from the perspective of the young people. And although, you know, I had my ideas like you did, Luciana, my biases, and, you know, I did a lot of reflexivity when I was doing my research and my writing. And, you know, for example, on inter-country adoption, I thought, well, you know, there were lots of malpractices, but, you know, those children must have been adopted by people who desperately wanted to have them. So, you know, it should be perhaps, you know, in many cases, it would be a happy story. I hoped. So I have to say that I was quiet after I started my PhD research here in Oxford. I was quite nervous because I thought, you know, why would someone would want to share their life story with me? I think I was lucky because, you know, having worked in the field for many years, I befriended a number of young people who were generous and, you know, we're friends, right? So they introduced me to other young people they knew who were not my friends, was able to interview, to speak to a number of professionals as well as academics in Romania. And, you know, people I knew, including, you know, personal friends, including NGOs, including people I met at a conference at some point, and I remembered they knew someone, or, you know, doing all sorts of searches to try and have a very wide experience of to capture different stories. And on the basis of that research, which I finished a few years ago, I then wrote a book which is going to be published in July by Policy Press. The book is called Voices from the Silent Cradles. And the reason is, again, one of those media narratives which appeared often, you know, that people would go and visit institutions for young children and the babies were silent. The babies had stopped crying. So quite briefly, what I found in my research before we start a dialogue between us, in those who grew up in residential care, I think that was to some extent, I had a few surprises here. In the first place, it was quite a mixed narrative. It wasn't a black and white picture at all. Even those who grew up in residential care from since they were born until they left the system in early 20s, you know, some got jobs and did quite well educationally. Some did, and now that what struck me was, for example, a parallel I did between a couple of young women I interviewed. They were both, and whose stories, although they grew up in different institutions, different parts of the country, but their stories shared a number of similarities. They are both almost born into the care system, placed into care since birth. They were at some point reunited with their family. And again, during the institutionalization, I heard this, I had, you know, a few people telling me, you know, children are being returned to families who are not prepared to, who don't have the conditions to look after them. And again, that's something I had in the back of my mind. So I wanted to see, not what I knew before I did the interviews, that I would come across such cases, but I did. So they did quite well educationally. The difference between these two young women, one graduated, you know, secondary school, the other one went to university, was that the one who didn't go to university, at the time of the interview, she was working in a textile factory, being quite poorly paid, and wanted to change her life, being desperate that she wanted to buy her own place. She was living somewhere by somebody, the kindness of what they call the kindness of strangers, and that appears for more than one young person. The other one went to university. Now the difference is that one of them was protected. She was the favorite child of a staff member in the institution, who was almost like a mentor to her, whereas the other girl who was from a Roma family, she didn't have the same protection. So some children were abused in institutions by older children or by staff. Some children weren't. And that had to do very much with where you came from, or, how, I suppose, how good you were as a child. Those were the children who were chosen at some point. They are both doing well these days. One emigrated and works abroad. The one who was working in the textile factory. The other one who graduated, she could have been a teacher, but she chose a different profession. Even those who went to university didn't have the social capital young people need in any country, I would say, to start a career. So they tended to do jobs which are below their qualifications, but doing quite well. Both girls had been reunited with their families for a short spell, for short periods of time. And they both referred to that as being the most difficult time of their life. None of them felt really that they belonged there. They were used to their institution and they wanted to go back and went back. The one of them, who came from a Roma family, she was called by her siblings normalista, the normal one, because she was the only one in the family who had this kind of clear, despite the not having a privileged experience in the institution, she had this clear trajectory. She graduated secondary school and then or vocational training, and then she went into employment. She had the support of the institution, who introduced her to an employer, so she could get that job. She made friends in the community, so there was this support in the community welcoming her. A lot of young men, for example, had mentors amongst teachers or care staff, or and that really helped them into developing skills which helped them in adult life. A couple of differences here: those who were born, went into care at an earlier age, most of them didn't speak about any long-term relationships, like romantic relationships, by the time I did the first interview. So there is something there which I think is interesting from a research point of view. The difficulty in building trust and going. I wouldn't even say that trust, because I think that deserves a very sensitive, gentle, separate piece of research before we are able to label what exactly it is. But that's exactly why I wanted to do a qualitative research, what they call, to interview and to really understand as much as possible and as gentle in the most sensitive and ethical manner what their perspectives were, because I think numbers are good, but policymakers certainly, appreciate that you can generalize from statistics, but there's a lot they don't tell us. So those who went into care later on, having siblings, for them, institutional care was a chance for education, and that's how they phrased it. I think that's, and there was, quite, they had quite good personal lives as well in adulthood. I do think, that those who suffered from abuse in institutions indeed they should have access to therapy, and there must be, you know, it's just a moral obligation for Romania to undertake some restorative justice for the young people who grew up in residential care, you know, pay for therapy for those who don't have, you know, friends or faith, which prove to be other protective factors. Not everybody believes in that, but some of them do need it. And really acknowledgement of what is wrong about those institutions. There were, you know, biases. We'll discuss about them later. Now, I'll move quickly to foster care and what happened there. So foster care, you know, at least for this generation, I think, which was the first generation of children who went into foster care, I would say. Before that, you know, the children were, you know, placed from institution into foster care as very young children, and when they were sent to intercountry adoption, that was a different story. But, you know, children being, I don't know, between 7 and 14, who for different reasons were placed with foster families, institutions being closed down, and so on. Now, those narratives are quite different. And again, what surprised me, altogether I did 40 interviews. What surprised me in foster care was a very gendered sort of influenced outcomes, in the sense that the women, young women I interviewed, they married or they started a partnership at the age of 18, which is very different from what they have in Romania. So they kind of felt either they had to leave because they were unhappy in the foster placement where they had grown up, or they sometimes, you know, in one case it was a happy decision, but in other cases it was a sort of, you know, either arranged marriage or feeling that the pressure that they had to be married because they had to leave the foster placement. They had less support from the child protection services than those who grew up in residential care. So, you know, once placed with a family, the services felt it wasn't that much their obligation. Whereas the young men I interviewed, for them it was a different stories. Pretty much all of them continued to stay with their families, with their foster families beyond the age of 18. And quite interestingly, you know, sometimes foster families were not the people who were recruited on purpose. But for example, one woman went to an institution because she wanted to do something good for a child in care. So she wanted to take a child for the Easter and stay with her daughter. And you know, they went to the institution. They were given a child, and it was just a happy match because the child loved it in that home, and there was that bond and that click. So eventually the woman gave up the job she was doing at the time, and she became her foster carer. Right, thank you, Luciana. Time is flying. Domestic adoption. Well, in adoption, I found a very different story between domestic and international adoption. And I think that for me, that was fascinating to see how different the stories were, just because those adopted in Romania were in the same, maintain their language and their culture, whereas the Convention on the Rights of the Child, you know, speaks about continuity. When it speaks about children in care, they should maintain their environment, which of course in international adoption is not possible. Although, you know, there is this culture of secrecy, and a lot of the children, you know, found out who were adopted in Romania when they started to grow from play friends and from others, that they were adopted not from their parents, or one of them found during a conflict, teenage conflict with their parents, that he was adopted in adult life, they did very well. They had very committed adoptive parents. So the secrecy was a thing. And actually I asked them, and when should a child be told that they're adopted? And the answer is less clear than the law is. Let me put it that way. So, but they all did very well. They all were supported by their parents, went into higher education. One was into conflict during teenage years, but he still went to university, had all the background. Some had special needs, even those with special needs. So that kind of confirms what my curator said, that we should be really reluctant about using words such as irrecoverable. I think it's really important the language we're using and whether we see them, these young people, as being capable of doing things or being unable to do anything. And that's, a discussion we need to have in the moral domain, if you want, right? Inter-country adoption, lots of identity struggles, which translated in adult life with, difficulty in maintaining jobs in, many of the young people I interviewed had teenage conflicts with their adoptive parents. They grew up with, none of them was helped to learn the language, or as they were growing up, or to maintain that. So they're treated as sort of tabula rasa. Forget about Romania, it was that country, I'm trying to avoid hard words, but there, how Romania was described to them is in the book, and the book is full of quite powerful quotes from the young people. So I think this is what I've had to say briefly, and yeah, I think there is a lot to be done in terms of looking and at this episode from Romania's history. I think it's important for our collective identity. Romania is a Christian country. I believe Romania is a child-loving country. About what you said about the 70s and the 60s, basically the years after the decree after 1966, it was a very aggressive institutionalization policy. And from what I know, I think you've discussed with Isidore.
Yes.
From your reading, I remember the ABC, I think it was some American TV program, going with him with a helicopter to his mother's house. I mean, the mothers of these children are the one group which hasn't been researched from a feminist perspective. It's in a lot of cases, I don't know the stories, in some cases where, very few cases when mothers don't want to speak with the children, whether it's shame or someone else, we don't know. But in many cases, it was a story of disempowerment. People who are incredibly poor for a society, in a society which was poor already. And there came all these, in the first place, it came the state, which said, if your child was underweight, they had to place the child into care. If their child had health issues, parents were obliged. That wasn't consent, as in many cases, it wasn't consent to adoption. So children were removed from these mothers, they were coerced into giving up their children. And, I think it's very hard for anybody to fight a system, to fight professionals. People trust professionals, people trust doctors. If they tell you, this is where your child should be. And the reason in some cases, it was forced institutionalization because, parents were not given any support, they were not given any choices. And if they were born, underweight, there was a fear that
Yes.
the child would die, which would look bad on the record of the doctor, and the
So,
doctor would get in trouble with the secret
yes.
police. So I think, yeah,
So they were kept in the hospital with really no parents agreeing on this. It was just the way it was done
exactly.
at the time. So we have this the story of Marion Leroy d'Anjou and the history with her mother, who was a teenager at the time she was born. So, and the mother was forced to place her in this lagoon for newborns because she was like she was hospitalized from the very beginning. So the doctor said, leave her with us, we'll take care of her, and you are young anyway, you should go to school, finish your school, and after that you can come and look for a child. We know from the reality that never happened. She was placed for intercountry adoption, and the mother was told that in fact the child died.
That was not an uncommon story.
Yes. Yeah, and Isidore and his stories with his parents, his family. I mean, one of the lies that was told to possibly adoptive parents, American adoptive parents, was that they were coming to Romania to save those children that were left alone in the homes for unrecoverable children. And in fact, once they arrived in Romania, they were very surprised to find out that they had families. And many of those children, especially Sighetu Marmației in 1990 and 1991, left Romania without the consent of their families. So once they arrived in the United States, they never got the citizenship just because of that. And now they are adults in a very weird and complicated legal state.
Exactly. It's a legal, international legal vacuum which really needs to be addressed. And I think, again, there is a moral duty for anyone who wants to gain back their citizenship. But, you know, the law is done in such a way that they automatically gain it. Because one of the young people has told me in the interview, you know, Romania failed us. So there is that feeling of being, you know, not really integrated in the new country, but being abandoned by the old one.
Yes, it's like a ping pong between the countries on the subject.
Yes, and speaking about the, you know, the aggressive institutionalization, of course, I mean, Ceausescu wanted to have a big nation. That's why, you know, all those institutions were built, because they said, you know, women must have children, and then the state is going to raise the children. So, and once the institutions were built, of course, they had to be filled in with children. So that's why, you know, it kind of acted like, you know.
Yes, but it was a little bit just the opposite. In reality, it was like a tsunami of abandoned children. So they never really had the places for all of those children. This is why, besides the orphanages and the other homes meant for children from the very beginning, we have a lot of children placed in hospitals, especially in the countryside. So I know some cases of children that grew up in some country hospital with no identity, no personal papers, nothing, no. So they had like 11, 12 years old at the time. They never attended school. They were completely illiterate. So even they were placed in these psychiatric hospitals for adults. I'm not talking here about the homes for unrecoverable, but psychiatric facilities for adults, and we can find children there. So I think it was like they pushed for these babies, but in the end they never had the money to care for all of them.
Yes, yes, and as it's described, I think in the book where we are one of the authors, you know, in some institutions, indeed, in the 80s, when the economic crisis was at its peak, I think, you know, the mortality was quite high in some of the institutions in the country, the infant mortality, especially for young children.
And in the country in general, I just have to say this, Romania had 4 times higher infant mortality than any other country in Europe, even the countries in the communist bloc, not mentioning the western part of the Europe, France and the other. Yes, and the institution was even worse.
To give an example of how aggressive it was, I saw a paper of a friend of mine who grew up in Kier, and it was the paper she had, like the decision of institutionalization, where it said that the mother had no income. The mother was quite young, a single mother. However, she was asked to pay an amount of money. I think it was, yes, every month. Yes. For the institutionalization of her child. So she had no support to keep her child. She was not supported in any way, but yet she had no income, but yet she was expected to pay.
Yes, that's totally true. This is such a weird part of the system and mostly unknown until now, that in fact the state made the biological families pay for the care of their children that were put in institution. And it's horrendous to see the situation of parents that had their children declared unrecoverable. So they were like sent there to die, because this is the truth, and the parents paid half of their income for their children, and in some cases the children died for some years. The parents never knew that, and they continued to pay. And yes. the child was in fact dead, and they knew nothing about it, and they thought the child was cared for in that institution.
Yes, I think when you start to look into it, the number of extraordinary stories is just too large. Yes. And beyond the law and beyond any human rights. I remember that in one of the documentaries the European Commission funded as part of the Children Home is Not a Real Home campaign, the journalist found a child who was placed in an institution. The mother was told that the child had died, but in fact the child was sent to another institution hundreds of kilometers away. And then I think it was in the late 90s when they started to kind of identify the families of the children. The mother of this child was a very rich person. She was regarded as the queen of white magic in Romania. It was this Roma family, incredibly rich, with a marble palace and everything. So, and that was her first child. Eventually she had other children, but she always thought of the first child who she knew but had died. And of course the child grew up knowing that she didn't have a family. And then when she was about 14, there was this, I think it was this van, you know, quite expensive, luxurious car, which arrived at the institution, taking her back home, where she started to have tuition. It was the most incredible story, but this is how the state behaved with the children. And, you know, this tendency to treat them as, you know, we know so little, and there is no way we could. I think the child protection should be not only in Romania, in more welfare in other welfare states as well. Should be built on moral principles rather than assumptions of what is good and what is wrong.
Yes, this is definitely true.
So I think, you know, there would be a lot to say on this. There is no way we can ever exhaust the subject.
Yes, because in fact there are so many subjects in here. I mean, everything. Even if you take the intercountry adoptions, besides your incredible, wonderful research that I loved, I think we can, I don't know, find another 1,000 stories as emotional, as important. In fact, this is what people forget. Every story is important. Every child is important.
Yes, exactly. And that's where I hope that the Institute is going to take this further, because, you know, it's impossible to evolve without looking history in the eyes and acknowledging.
I'm certainly trying to do that. I never abandoned. It is kind of my promise to children, even if they died or they are alive now. And I just try to put them on this map of or list of victims of the communist regime from my perspective, because you know we have all these crimes, but not so many victims. So we can show and demonstrate what happened, but in terms of victims, they are still invisible. I'm afraid they are still invisible. Their voices, without us as researchers on the subject, they will remain like forever unknown and unheard.
I think now that you're saying that, I think, you know, that indeed doing these interviews, I understood that just telling the stories, your story has a therapeutic power almost. And I had more than several young people telling me at the end of the interview that actually, you know, I've told you things I haven't ever told to anyone else. So perhaps, you know, in a very sensitive and ethical manner, if there would be a way for them to put down their stories, not necessarily, you know, in the way they want, with name or without name, their name, but collect those stories for the sake of history and learning from it. And I think that sort of, you know, stereotypes, they continue because it's just how people prefer to see the world, you know, in quite clear boxes. It's so complicated. We need to rethink. And I think the times we live, you know, there is a sort of predisposition for rethinking the world in different fields and policies, and not just in Romania, but everywhere. And I think history has an important role because we need to learn from it, but to learn from it, we need to get the documents and the stories together.
Yes, and we have to do history a little bit differently. I mean, we have to move a little bit over from the archives, because we have to admit it now, many of the archives of those institutions that last forever, so we can never recuperate that memory. But we have the children, we have the survivors,
exactly,
we still have the families. So we still have this great opportunity to make things right from a historical perspective, and gather all these testimonies and keep them for I don't know, later research, maybe in 20, 30 years. And
absolutely.
have this possibility to look at things maybe less emotionally, because you did not mention this, but I know it from my own experience. It's excruciating for the researcher to work for years on topics like that, because the child we talk to in 6 months, a year, 2 years, they become our friends, they come close to us.
Exactly, yeah.
Of course, we try to keep the balance, to be professional, because methodological, this is not at all what it should be, to get personally involved with the story. But when you work with these children, it's impossible not to get personally involved. It's impossible.
Yes,
And
it's
more you get involved, more you understand.
absolutely. Yes.
This is at least it's my experience with it.
Well, it's also a matter of respect, you know, because you're not just, when you engage with listening the story, you become someone in the other's life, someone they shared their story with. So there is also, I see it as a matter of respect. And yes, I have stayed in touch with the number of the young people I interviewed, and sometimes they had questions which and I guided them where they could go, for example, to find their families and so on and so forth. So it's a human encounter.
Yes, and they trusted you with their most intimate experiences and thoughts. So it's your turn to give them something back. And results of our research, I think, is giving them back. It's not justice for justice, but at least it's some form of justice.
Yes, it's a duty, I would say.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Luciana. Thank you, Romanian Cultural Institute, for bringing this to your platform. And let's hope that, our work is going to make a difference somehow to those who need better quality care. Yes, actually, there were two things I wanted to say, and I forgot, was that what mattered in the end to the children was the quality of care, and not the type of placement. So not whether they were in an institution or in foster care or in adoption, but how they were treated by their carers. The other thing I wanted to say, and I think it's relevant about human nature in general, it's good to know that about us as a species, is that stigmatization, and that surprised me, appeared in all types of placement, not only in residential care. Being from the care system was kind of labeled, but what foster care allowed them was to develop strategies to hide their status, and they did that successfully sometimes in residential care as well. But that wasn't the case when there were many children in the children's home, in the school, who were from the children's home. So it was very different. But even those who went to private schools, because they were adopted international by families, were treated not as the spring as a child of a rich family, but as somebody who was adopted. So their sort of stigmatized status took precedence over the other one. And I think that says a lot about the importance of tackling stigma, of educating, and helping people to think differently. And that's why we need to show these young people, well, not show them, but want to hear them, to treat them with the respect they deserve. They're not in any way different from any of us. So thank you so much.
Indeed, thank you so much, Mariela, for the invitation, and of course the Romanian Cultural Institute for giving me the possibility to talk about my research and what the Institute for the Investigation of Communist Crimes in Romania is doing right now. So thank you again.
Thank you.